Hi, this is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and this video lesson for the SSCP certification covers business continuity planning. All right, so what is business continuity? That's figuring out what your most important stuff is and getting it working as soon as possible when things go wrong. Some people call it business continuity and resiliency planning, BCRP. Some people call it continuity of operations planning, COOP. I'll say business continuity is a superset of disaster recovery. In other words, disaster recovery is part of business continuity, and I cover disaster recovery in a later lesson. Basically, business continuity covers everything from power outages and employees leaving on vacation to disasters. But disaster recovery focuses primarily on the really serious stuff, floods, fires, earthquakes, etc. So as part of business continuity, of course, you have to consider all the different things that could go wrong. But your business continuity plan is going to define what to fix first and how to fix it. So of course, we have to prioritize all the different assets in the organization and figure out how to back them up and restore them. I like to just call business continuity your plan B, because of course your plan A is nothing breaks and everything just continues working. But what happens when things go wrong? Plan B. Just to make sure the two terms are crystal clear, here's a visualization of business continuity versus disaster recovery. Business continuity just helps the organization continue to go. Business continuity as a whole helps your organization continue to run when basically anything goes wrong that might interfere with your core business services. Disaster recovery helps you rebuild after a disaster. So here are some of the elements of business continuity planning, and the first is to determine procedures for business continuity. You know, if you study military strategy at all, you learn that they create procedures for everything that could go wrong proactively. They determine a whole bunch of different scenarios and prioritize them based on the actual risk of it, the rate of occurrence versus the damage that would happen. Then they take those high priority scenarios and figure out exactly what they should do if that happens. Why not just wait until it happens and then wing it? Well, people don't make great decisions under pressure. You make much better decisions when you can just sit back and be analytical about it and think, oh, okay, what if a power outage does last for a week? Do we send the employees home, or do we drag in a generator? And you'll have a bunch of people around the table and they'll say, well, if we send the employees home, then we won't be able to physically access the files, and that could cost us a lot. And somebody will say, okay, but where are we going to get a generator service? Now, because you've thought it out ahead of time, you can line up a generator service, and usually you'll pay some monthly fee to have them run in with a generator if you have an extended power outage. Or maybe you decide it's worth it to actually have large-scale generators installed. Even if you just decide to send employees home, it's better that you know it ahead of time, because it reduces the stress that you feel when things actually do go wrong. The business continuity planning process will also help you identify your critical business functions, which some people call your CBF. I just want you to know the lingo in case people start slinging that stuff around. This is any part of your business that you really need running right away. So for most organizations, this is going to be customer-facing services, things like your customer support line. If you can imagine, if you're a computer manufacturer and you're doing business continuity planning, of course you need your customer service lines up and running no matter what. Because if somebody gets a new computer home and it's not working properly, and then they call your customer support and it just rings, or there's a busy signal, well, that's a disaster. That's a one-star review for your company, and it permanently damages your reputation, and they're not willing to take that risk. So as part of their business continuity planning process, well, they're probably going to set up 2 different customer support locations in different parts of the world. And they're going to tell both the locations, hey, if there's a problem at this location, you might be up all night because we need somebody to cover them. That's an example of creating a countermeasure to minimize the disruption. And throughout the business continuity planning process, you're going to be coming up with different countermeasures. Now, so far in these lessons, we've kind of been talking about countermeasures in the context of computer security. You know, you add a firewall here, you install a patch here. These are countermeasures. But other countermeasures are simply making an agreement between 2 different tech support groups and saying they'll stay up late if the other one has some serious problem. Business continuity planning includes several elements that I've discussed in other lessons: risk mitigation planning, change management, business impact analysis, and recovery planning. So I've covered these in other lessons, which means I don't have to duplicate that here, and that's why this lesson is going to be fairly short, even though it's a massive topic. The reason is you already know this stuff, or you'll learn it in other lessons. I would like to add, though, I really need you to test your business continuity plans before you actually need it. So in the example of the customer support group, well, you have a fire drill. And you call up the organization, and maybe you just tell them, we haven't actually lost power, but we want you guys to stay available just so we know that everything is working properly. Everybody hates these fire drills, but you know what? It's not going to work perfectly. And when it doesn't work perfectly, you'll identify something that you can change about your recovery process. Maybe you have employees who are grumbling about it, and the way you decide to deal with that is you give them time and a half. You pay them a little bit more to be there. You'll uncover these types of problems and you'll find ways to solve it, and then when disaster actually strikes, you'll be prepared. But if you don't test it, you're not going to be prepared. Those surprises are going to crop up, and you're going to have employees calling in sick because they don't want to stay up all night. And then you know what? You get 1-star reviews because nobody answers the phone. You'll see this in other lessons too, but these are your priorities. Human safety, always first. As a security personnel, you have to protect human life over everything else. After that, security comes in, making sure that nobody can compromise the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of your data and services. Next up, you have protecting your most critical services and getting them back online. This might be your customer support desk. If you're an airport, maybe it's the runway lighting, or maybe it's the air traffic control. Next up, the customer-facing services. In the case of an airport, this might be things like the air conditioning or the big screens that tell you when flights are leaving. Obviously, these are important, but they're not as critical as human safety, which would involve the runway lights and the air traffic control. And finally, you want to get your non-critical services up and running. No matter how big the disaster was, eventually you need your organization back up and running at full speed. So the non-critical services tend to be things like upgrading computers, the accounting department dealing with people's expenses, human resources evaluating somebody for a raise. These are less critical things that if you wait a week or two, not too much of a problem. There's no one universally accepted business continuity planning process, but here's a common 5-step process that I'll walk through really quickly. The first is the business impact analysis, which I've discussed in other lessons. In this process, you will examine the value of all your assets, you will make a list of vulnerabilities, and then you'll decide how much of a risk each of the vulnerabilities is to your assets. This allows you to prioritize the vulnerabilities and scenarios that you need to respond to. Then you try to fix stuff. You develop solutions. You create plans to respond to the different events, starting with the highest priority events that you identified in the business impact analysis phase. Then you implement and you train. You document these processes step by step. You test them. You bring your employees in and you train them. If you need to buy a generator or backup lights, you buy it and you get it installed. If you need to make agreements with somebody else to loan you a facility or to provide emergency customer service for your organization, then you get those agreements in place. You test it. You pull the plug on some things and make sure that the system is working properly. My philosophy with testing is to start testing by simply notifying people, hey, we're going to be testing this in a week, so get your stuff together. It's not for real. We're not going to pull the plug on anything. We just want to make sure everything's okay. Start with a walkthrough. We'll just do make-believe, and then we'll find lots of problems. Then once you get all those problems ironed out, sometimes I like to do an actual cold test. I like to pull the plug on stuff and see how fast they can get it together. The nice thing about that is, well, you're still taking your real services offline, but you can bring them back online whenever you want. You can also schedule it for a time when it's not peak utilization. Some people will tell you always warn your staff about the upcoming tests, and some people will tell you not to warn them, that it's better to surprise them because the actual element of surprise can reveal places in your plan that you could improve. And finally, maintenance. This is a critical part of it all. Stuff changes, and when it changes, you need to change your plan as well. You'll buy new assets that need to be protected. People will leave the organization. Other people will come in. You know, if you have a new employee, of course, you have to train them in the business continuity process, or else it eventually degrades into nothing. And as part of the maintenance, when you discover new inventory, new assets, you start the whole process over again. We go back to business impact analysis because now we have to look for new vulnerabilities that impact that asset. We need to assess the asset, figure out how much it's worth. And that's why it's a cycle and not a more linear process. Throughout all of this, one element ties it all together, and that's documentation. I'm a writer, so this feels comfortable for me. Not everybody is so good at documentation. Sometimes people just want to have a plan in your head. It's important to write things down for a few reasons. One, documenting it makes these steps really easy to follow in the event of a disaster. It's also easy to transfer this to other people, either people in different parts of your organization, or maybe to yourself in the future in case you forget things. Also, it makes you more replaceable, which sounds bad, but is actually good, because you don't want your organization relying entirely on the knowledge that you have stored in your head. You should think about what happens when you get promoted and somebody else steps into your position. You don't want them calling you, asking you how to do every dumb little thing. So document everything you do so that somebody else could take over for you. So I'd like to talk a little bit about performing a business impact analysis specifically for business continuity planning, because it's not exactly the same as assessing the threats and vulnerabilities for security reasons. First, not all of the threats are security related. Sometimes it is just a power outage, and you're focusing on the impact of the event and then recovering from it. The table at the bottom of the slide shows examples of some subjective ways to assess the value of different assets to your organization. You can see it shows 3 different columns that describe each of the different assets. The urgency, which people use different terms here, but critical and non-critical are 2 easy terms. Sometimes you'll have 4 or 5 different values. In a quantitative business impact analysis, this might actually be the annual value of the asset. And the last 2 columns are the recovery point objective and the recovery time objective. And here's the difference. The recovery point objective is how much data you can stand to lose from that asset. And obviously this only applies to assets that have data. So you'll see a few different examples here. Starting at the bottom, the accounting database, you can probably stand to lose a day's worth of data because the accountants have a paper trail, right? If they're entering in people's expenses, well, people are filling out those annoying forms and sending them in through interoffice mail, or they're sending them through email or something else that might be archived. Then the accountants have to actually verify stuff and punch stuff in. So the accountants would be annoyed if they had to lose a day of work and they had to repeat what they had just done. But it's okay, right? You haven't lost that data permanently. A different example are financial transactions. Most organizations can't stand to lose a record of a financial transaction. If you're the New York Stock Exchange, you cannot lose a single transaction because there's a buyer and a seller. The ownership changed. And there's not a paper trail that you can go back to. Everything's electronic. So what if your record of that buying and selling simply disappeared? That would be completely intolerable. They cannot lose a single financial transaction. So that's why they have an RPO of 0 seconds. If you decide you have an RPO of 0 seconds, well, you've got a challenge ahead of you. You're going to have to work on some real-time synchronization off to a different geographic location. And you're not going to be able to commit that transaction until the synchronization has occurred and you have a real-time backup of it. The recovery time objective is a little bit different. This is how much downtime you can tolerate. It has nothing to do with how much data you can lose. While running water doesn't have a recovery point objective, it definitely has a recovery time objective. Your employees aren't going to be able to stay at the office without running water, mostly because they need running water because they have to be able to visit the bathrooms. This is a health issue. So the amount of time that you can tolerate is going to be different for different organizations. Even a 2-hour outage would definitely be a hardship for a lot of your employees. But you certainly can't have running water out for a day and expect your employees to come into the office. That wouldn't be acceptable. On the other hand, your public website, if it's down for a day, maybe it's not a big deal for you. That might be a more serious issue. You might have a lower RTO depending on your organization. But if your public website doesn't do anything important, it might be okay that it's down for a day. Speaking of financial transactions, the New York Stock Exchange wouldn't be able to tolerate a recovery time objective of 30 minutes, nor would any big bank. But some organizations might be able to handle a little bit of downtime. They still wouldn't be able to tolerate losing any data, but if they were offline for a little bit, then those transactions could just continue when they brought the system back online. You need to consider staffing too. How long can you be without a particular role being fulfilled in the organization? For example, if you have one accountant and that person quits and they go off to a different organization, well, how long can you stand to be without them? In this example, I decided that we could deal without having an accountant for a couple of weeks. A bunch of paperwork would pile up on the accountant's desk, and when they hired a new accountant, well, they'd have some catching up to do. But it would be okay, right? The way you can ensure a decent recovery time objective for staffing is you can do it contractually. You can say you have to give us 2 weeks notice. That's a coincidence, right? 2 weeks notice versus a recovery time objective of 2 weeks. If your recovery time objective is something shorter, well, you might have to hire a second person or do some cross-training. Maybe you have an office manager who can study the accounting staff's work and learn how to enter in the information in the event that they have an extended outage. Your recovery time objective for staff also basically becomes the maximum vacation time that the person could take consecutively. Obviously, if you have one accountant, they couldn't take a 6-month sabbatical. You'd have to hire somebody else. In the case of the accounting database, we had a RPO of 1 day and an RTO of 2 weeks. Again, I think it's usually okay for most organizations to let the paperwork pile up, but you probably wouldn't want your accountants to have to enter in 2 weeks of information over again, right? That would be costly because you'd have to pay them to do the same work twice. But if it sat there for a couple of weeks, well, you're not paying anything for that. Therefore, the recovery time objective can be longer than the recovery point objective. IT contingency planning is the part of the business continuity planning process that deals specifically with computer systems. So this is what us IT nerds get into, right? This includes all the security threats that we've been learning about in other lessons, as well as system failures and overall disasters. Of course, wherever possible, you want to implement preventative controls. This can be UPSs, uninterruptible power supplies that keep computers running in the event of a power outage, combined with, say, a diesel-based generator that can take over long-term replacement for your power outage. It can be removing single points of failure. If you decide that some systems are critical, well, you need to implement some redundancy. This could be dual routers, dual firewalls, dual network switches, clusters of servers. If your web server is critical, maybe you implement a server farm with load distribution, or maybe you implement multiple server farms. Of course, everybody thinks it's critical until you start to assign a dollar value to it, and then you say, yes, we can have complete redundancy, but it's going to cost you $2 million. Then you decide, maybe it's not that critical. You have to weigh everything, right? And of course, one of the ways you can improve availability for services is just documenting your recovery plans. Just write down the steps of how to get a server back online when things do go wrong. Where are the backup tapes stored? How do you get that software running? Where can we find a replacement network adapter when that fails? How do we order replacement hardware if everything catches on fire? Write everything down ahead of time and you'll find recovery is much, much faster. And of course, I'll say the obvious, back stuff up and test your backups. Here's a typical recovery plan for a failed IT service. First, you'll grab the business continuity plan documentation and you'll take a look at it and you'll see if it really is up to date. Because in theory, you're going through and you're updating the BCP every time you add a new server or you change or something or you tweak something, but in reality, they're always a little bit out of date at least. So the first step is to take a look and make any updates that are necessary. Next, you start your Plan B. This is the paper-based manual process that you're using while the server is down. This isn't going to apply for every type of service, but for example, in the case of an accounting server failure, this could involve them filing paper in a filing cabinet rather than a server and writing checks by hand rather than doing direct deposit. They could follow this process until the time when the server gets back up and running. Of course, you need some spot checking for these manual processes just to make sure that people are executing them correctly because it's not a process they're following on a day-to-day basis. So you need to make sure that all the numbers add up to the accountants and that they're filing things in the right place. Put this in your plan. So now that you have Plan B up and running and being double-checked, it's time to schedule your staff to restore the services. If you have an outside consulting firm that handles installing your computers, give them a call. Call whoever your experts are. Maybe it's just a different guy in the IT department and let them know that something needs to be restored. That person's going to have to order some replacement equipment in this particular scenario. So they'll have to call Dell or the equipment manufacturer and follow the process they have for having equipment delivered as soon as possible. And finally, once everything's lined up, you get it plugged in and you reinstall your software and you return to Plan A gradually. And obviously, this is just an example. It's a high-level plan. Your actual plan is going to have hundreds of little steps, probably hundreds of steps under each one of these things. Just make sure that it's detailed enough to actually follow it in the event of an emergency. So let's talk about succession planning, which is what happens when somebody leaves the organization. Well, you need to have somebody else take over their role, right? Especially if it's a critical role. Sometimes, as you see in this illustration here, it means having a subordinate move into a managerial position, and then somebody beneath them taking over their place. That's actually kind of the best case scenario, because one person leaves, but then everybody gets a promotion, right? It's not bad. Well, you need to have a plan for this event. Sometimes your plan is just going to be the accountant needs to give 2 weeks notice, and that gives us 2 weeks to hire a replacement or find a temporary worker. Sometimes in the event of a CEO or a high-ranking official in your organization, you need to have a more serious plan in place. If a CEO leaves, it's important to have somebody assigned to take over that position, because you can't go a day without a CEO. And you know what? If you leave it until the end, you're going to find all the VPs are bickering about who's going to get the promotion. So pick the replacement ahead of time. You know, in the U.S. government, we have a president and a vice president. And there's no question what happens if the president is unable to serve. The VP steps in. That decision's already been made. That is succession planning. And they have a succession plan going way down through like a dozen different people who can take over if something happens to each succeeding person. If they didn't have that plan, can you imagine all the people who'd want to take over for the president if something was wrong? All the panic that would go on, all the arguing that would go on. None of that needs to happen. The VP just takes over. There's no stress. We know exactly how things will unfold. So in the context of an IT department, you need to think about what critical roles each person fills. If they have information that nobody else has, well, you need to make sure they document it and they put that documentation in a place where their replacement can find it. You need to think about things like account management, like who's going to be changing passwords and creating new user accounts. If you have a public key infrastructure, your digital certificate key management is really important, because often the recovery keys are tied to an individual person. Anyway, you need to tie it to a specific role and make sure that role can be transferred from one individual to another. Here's some different ways you can test your business continuity plan. I just want you to be familiar with these terms and the depth of each one. A component test just tests an individual asset. So you can say, what happens if this server fails? And just test that part of the business continuity plan. Obviously, you're not thinking about what happens during a power outage, because that would affect other components. It's a very isolated type of test. A tabletop test is easy to do and terribly useful. It won't find every possible flaw in your plan, but it will find a lot of them. In a tabletop test, you basically just gather all the key stakeholders in a room and you role play. You just paint a picture like a dungeon master in a Dungeons and Dragons game. You'll say, what if we lost the power right now? What would we do? And each person would speak up and say, well, I'm in charge of safety, so I would start escorting people out of the building, or whatever the plan is. And you would continue on throughout the whole process until you have things back up and running in this role-playing scenario. Now, in a walkthrough test, it works basically the same, except you physically walk around. So in the tabletop test, you might imagine that you're walking everybody out of the building. In the walkthrough test, you get up and you start escorting people out of the building. A live test, also known as a full simulation test, well, in this case, you'd actually pull the plug and you'd cut the power if that's the particular scenario you were testing. If you're doing a live test of a power outage, you pull the plug on the power and see how people actually respond. Obviously, you wouldn't do that for a fire, but you might start the fire alarm and let people know it's a drill so they don't actually panic, but you'd escort them out the building and you'd continue through the process until you've recovered from the disaster and systems are back up and running. Throughout any type of test, you're making note of the stuff that doesn't go smoothly, things that are overlooked, things that don't work properly, and you're making updates to the business continuity plan so that when it does happen for reals, it's going to be okay. And finally, I just wanted to throw out some business continuity planning tips from my own actual experience. Don't start from scratch. If you just search online, you'll find tons of free templates that can help you form a structure for your plan, and surveys that will help you gather the information you need for your business continuity planning. I also say don't ask managers to prioritize the assets in their department, because I can tell you their answer: critical. Everything's critical. Everything we do is critical. All of our people are super critical and can't be replaced. Don't ask them to assess the value. Instead, ask them for the data that you need to prioritize the value of their assets. Be quantitative whenever possible. That means assigning dollar values to particular assets. But don't go too far out of your way for it. I'll say most business continuity planning is actually qualitative. You just say things are critical rather than saying this asset is worth $2 million annually. But when you do have the data, a quantitative assessment is much more meaningful than a qualitative assessment. And remember, BCP is not a project. It's a process. It's a cycle. So instead of planning one meeting, plan regular meetings. Plan a meeting every 6 months or 2 months or 1 year or whatever you think is necessary to keep your BCP up to date. You also need to be finding both new assets that are installed in your organization and new threats that are emerging as security changes. And different people prefer a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach. I'm a top-down guy. I think you should start with the top-level executives, get them to buy into the whole BCP process, and then ask them to delegate tasks to their managers. Basically the task of providing information so you can assess different assets, as well as helping to create the business continuity plan for assets that they control. And finally, practice stuff. Test it. If you don't test it, you don't know what's going to happen when disaster really strikes. This is Tony Northrup for Train Signal, and thanks so much for watching this video lesson.